The sea between America and Japan once looked endless, silent, almost indifferent. But beneath those waters, in the shadows where light dies and steel groans, two very different wars were being fought. One would help strangle an empire until it collapsed under its own hunger. The other would barely whisper in the pages of history. And the strange part is this: both sides had submarines. Both sides had the technology, the crews, the courage. Yet only one used them to rewrite the entire war in the Pacific. It didn't happen quickly. It didn't happen cleanly. But little by little, mile by mile, the American submarine fleet squeezed Japan's lifelines until entire cities starved, factories stalled, and soldiers awaited supplies that would never come. Japan, an island nation built on the flow of imports, was slowly suffocating. And most civilians had no idea why. But to understand how this quiet strangulation became one of the most decisive campaigns of the war, you have to rewind the clock to the years before Pearl Harbor, when the United States Navy wasn't yet the hunter it would become, and when Japan's submarine force believed its future was written in the grand clashes of battleships and aircraft carriers. Ironically, that belief would doom them. Long before the war erupted across the Pacific, both nations saw submarines in completely different ways. The United States viewed subs as wolves, silent predators meant to stalk merchant shipping, starve economies, and dismantle the machinery of war without ever surfacing. But the Japanese High Command envisioned something far more dramatic. They wanted submarines that could strike capital ships, support massive fleet battles, and deliver knockout blows worthy of samurai legend. It was ambition, wrapped in steel, yes, but completely disconnected from the kind of war Japan actually had to fight. Japan depended on imported oil, metals, rubber, and food. 40% of daily essentials arrived by sea. Every day, tankers and freighters marched across the Pacific in long, predictable routes. They were the arteries that kept the empire alive. Sever them, and the whole body would collapse. But somehow, the nation that needed submarines the most used them for the least important jobs. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ocean, the American submarine fleet was quietly preparing for a different kind of war. They trained in stealth, patience, and long-range independence. Their commanders were taught to strike merchant vessels without hesitation, because Washington understood something Japan refused to see. Wars are not won only by the ships that fire the biggest guns, but by the ships that deliver the quiet essentials: fuel, grain, bullets, coal. Destroy those, and armies die where they stand. Yet when the war finally broke out, the Americans weren't ready in the way history often portrays. Their torpedoes malfunctioned. Their officers doubted their own doctrine. Many submarine commanders hesitated, unsure if unrestricted warfare was moral or legal. Early patrols often returned without results, sometimes without firing a single shot. But after Pearl Harbor, everything changed. Hours after the attack, without waiting for political debates or diplomatic niceties, U.S. submarines were ordered to wage unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. It was a massive gamble. No nation had ever deployed its entire submarine fleet in a mission to wipe out another nation's shipping. And for the first year, it barely worked. Torpedoes ran too deep. Magnetic detonators failed. Contact fuses misfired. Submarine captains sometimes watched helplessly as perfect shots simply thudded uselessly into the hulls of enemy ships. Still, the Americans kept hunting, learning, adapting. Every patrol made them better, sharper, more ruthless. And every time a torpedo did work, Japan lost another piece of the lifeline it desperately needed. But Japan didn't respond the way you might expect. Instead of protecting their merchant ships with convoy systems, the same strategy that saved Britain in the Atlantic, they clung to the idea that merchant vessels should sail alone, undefended, because escorts were needed for glamorous fleet operations. Japan had the destroyers, they had the training, but their naval leadership believed escort duty was beneath them, a distraction from the decisive battle they imagined was coming. So their merchant ships sailed like sheep through waters filled with wolves. That arrogance gave the U.S. submarines the freedom to operate almost anywhere, anytime. They could ambush at night, slip between islands, and lie motionless beneath shipping lanes like underwater mines with minds of their own. Even when Japanese commanders finally realized their mistake and began forming convoys, it was too late. By then, American submarines had grown too skilled, too aggressive, too experienced. But what about Japan's own submarines? Why didn't they do to America what America was doing to them? To understand that, you have to step into the minds of Japan's naval planners before the war. They believed battleships and aircraft carriers were the soul of naval warfare. Submarines were merely supporting actors in a huge choreographed clash that would repeat the glory of Tsushima decades earlier. Japanese subs were ordered to shadow fleets, intercept American warships, and wait for dramatic targets: aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers. Merchant ships were considered unworthy prey. Even worse, Japanese submarine commanders were given missions so complex and unrealistic that success became almost impossible. They were told to coordinate with surface fleets, attack in groups, and patrol vast areas with limited fuel. Their boats were large, expensive, and poorly suited for fast, brutal commerce raiding. Many had slow dive times. Some carried aircraft which took up valuable space and served little purpose in the actual war. As months passed, Japan slowly realized its submarines were accomplishing almost nothing of strategic value. They sank a few American warships, yes, but nothing that crippled America's capacity to fight. Meanwhile, American submarines were cutting Japan's throat more effectively every month. Back home, Japanese factories were already feeling the pain. Without oil, machines sputtered. Without steel, production slowed to a crawl. Without food imports, soldiers at distant garrisons began rationing, then starving. Supplies once measured in months were now counted in weeks. And though Tokyo hid the crisis from the public, the truth was unavoidable. Every ship lost to an American torpedo was another hour shaved off Japan's future. The real tragedy was that Japan's own submarines could have done the same to the United States. Between Hawaii and the West Coast lay thousands of miles of shipping lanes, brimming with tankers and transports, but Japan barely touched them. Instead, their submarines spent precious patrols chasing American warships that rarely appeared. And so, the war beneath the waves became horrifyingly one-sided. The Americans didn't win because they had better boats at the start. They didn't win because of magic technology. They won because they understood where Japan was vulnerable, and because they were willing to strike at that vulnerability day after day, month after month, until Japanese industry collapsed from within. But the real shift, the turning point that transformed this strategy from theory into a devastating weapon, was still coming. Because once America fixed its torpedo problems, once experienced captains took command, and once patrol areas expanded deeper into Japanese waters, the submarine force would unleash a campaign unlike anything the Pacific had ever seen. A campaign that would send entire fleets of merchant ships to the ocean floor, and push Japan toward a slow, suffocating disaster it could never escape. The shift began quietly, almost unnoticed, somewhere in the vast emptiness of the Pacific. A few submarines returned from patrols with more ships sunk than ever before. A handful of commanders grew bolder, taking risks others had avoided. And one discovery, simple, infuriating, almost laughable, changed everything. The torpedoes weren't broken beyond repair. They were just misunderstood, miscalibrated, and sabotaged by design flaws Washington refused to admit for almost 2 years. But once the submarine crews forced the Navy to face reality, the floodgates opened. Technicians tore apart magnetic detonators and rebuilt contact fuses. Depth settings were corrected. Suddenly, American torpedoes began behaving like the killers they were meant to be. The ocean, once filled with wasted shots and near misses, started erupting with violent bursts of water and steel. Japanese ships that previously shrugged off attack after attack now simply vanished beneath the waves. At the center of this transformation stood a new breed of submarine commanders, men like Dudley Mush Morton, Richard O'Kane, and Eugene Fluckey. They weren't interested in cautious patrols or timid tactics. They lunged at convoys in broad daylight, fired spreads of torpedoes from impossible angles, and chased fleeing ships deep into narrow harbors where no submarine was ever meant to venture. Some captains became legends, others never returned home. But together, they reshaped the war beneath the waves. Japan watched the numbers rise with growing alarm. Ships that once traveled alone now traveled in convoys, but even these protective bubbles quickly shattered. American subs learned to strike at night, slipping beneath escorts, firing, then diving deep as explosions rocked the surface. Radar gave them eyes in the darkness. Better sonar, improved torpedoes, and hardened experience made them almost untouchable. The ocean was becoming a hunting ground with no safe corners left. Meanwhile, Japanese submarine doctrine remained trapped in a fantasy. Instead of hitting supply ships, Japan's submarines continued chasing American carriers, rare, fast-moving targets protected by destroyers and aircraft. When opportunities to attack U.S. logistics did appear, they were often ignored in favor of more honorable missions. They had the range to strike far into the Indian Ocean, the tools to cripple American industry, and the chance to disrupt troop movements, fuel lines, and vital supply routes. But the High Command failed to see the battlefield for what it was. And by the time they realized their mistake, the Empire had already begun running out of fuel, literally. Japanese ships were soon forced to reduce speed, convoys slowed, escorts thinned out. Tankers that once made steady runs to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies returned less frequently, and eventually, not at all. Even the mighty Japanese Navy, with its towering battleships and iconic carriers, faced a crisis it could not escape. You cannot command the seas with empty fuel tanks, and American submarines made sure those tanks would never be full again. Every successful patrol created ripples across the Pacific. In factories, production lines stalled because machinery could no longer be fed. At distant outposts from New Guinea to the Solomons to the Philippines, garrisons waited for resupply ships that were already lying at the bottom of the ocean. Troops rationed ammunition, then food, then hope. Soldiers who were once part of a lightning-fast empire found themselves abandoned on islands with no chance of rescue. Even the civilian population in Japan felt the tightening grip. Lights dimmed, food grew scarce, coal arrived slowly, trains slowed to conserve power. Entire industries shrank. And still, Tokyo tried to hide the truth, insisting victory was near even as the empire was being quietly starved to death. But in the water, the submarine war grew only more intense. Each patrol brought new challenges, new dangers, new moments where a single depth charge could mean death. Japanese destroyers became more skilled. Aircraft patrols increased. Mines were laid across vital channels. Submarines began returning home with scars, dented hulls, destroyed equipment, wounded sailors. The crews who fought this war lived in darkness and silence, breathing recycled air, sleeping next to torpedoes, and listening to depth charges thunder above them like cracks in the world itself. Yet they continued, again and again, because each ship they sank brought the war one step closer to ending. Some of the most incredible feats emerged in these desperate final years. There were submarines that surfaced inside enemy anchorages, firing torpedoes at ships lined up like targets in a carnival game. There were captains who slipped through fog-covered straits, dodging patrols so closely that sailors swore they could hear voices on the decks above. Some submarines rescued downed American pilots. Others landed commandos behind enemy lines. A few even destroyed entire convoys single-handedly. Japanese sailors came to fear the unseen more than anything else. They knew that somewhere, beneath the hulls of their own ships, an American submarine might be trailing them, watching, waiting for the perfect moment. Rumors spread that the enemy could hear everything, could strike anywhere, could appear without warning. Fear itself became a weapon. And while American submarines prowled like sharks, the Japanese submarine force drifted further into irrelevance. Their boats were underused, misdirected, and sacrificed on missions that offered no real tactical or strategic gain. They attacked naval vessels that America could replace, while Americans attacked merchant ships Japan could not. Every submarine wasted on a futile hunt for battleships was a wasted opportunity. Another day America's supply lines remained untouched. Another day Japan's economy bled dry. Some Japanese officers knew this. Some begged for a shift in strategy, for a campaign that targeted America's lifelines, not its mightiest warships. But they were silenced by tradition, pride, and the rigid belief that only a grand naval duel could decide the war. The war, however, was being decided in night-black waters, by men whose names most people would never know. Convoys shrank, then they stopped. Desperation grew. Japanese tankers began mixing crude oil with anything that would burn. Some ships left port filled with fuel so contaminated it destroyed their engines mid-voyage. Others had to be towed. Fuel shortages became so severe that the Japanese Navy eventually restricted operations altogether. Battleships that had once been symbols of national pride sat motionless in harbors, unable to sail. Meanwhile, American submarines kept pushing deeper, closer to the Japanese homeland, attacking within sight of coastal lights. They targeted coal ships, fishing fleets, troop transports, troop reinforcements, anything that moved. Japanese patrols scrambled, often with little fuel left for extended chases. Skilled destroyer captains became rare. Many died in earlier battles or were reassigned. The Empire was running on fumes. On maps in Washington, the pattern became undeniable. Each patrol zone showed fewer and fewer Japanese vessels. Shipping losses skyrocketed. By 1944, Japan's merchant fleet was collapsing at a speed no nation could survive. And for the first time, the American High Command realized something chilling. Submarines, not battleships, not aircraft carriers, were becoming the most decisive weapon in the Pacific. What Japan's submarines failed to destroy, America's submarines had mastered. And the imbalance was growing so rapidly that the end of the war no longer depended on a single grand battle. It depended on the slow, relentless cutting of supply lines, one ship at a time. But the breaking point, the moment when Japan's future became sealed, was still on the horizon. A moment when the last lifelines would snap, and the empire, once unstoppable, would begin to crumble under the silent weight of the ocean. By the final year of the war, the Pacific no longer looked like a battlefield. It looked like a graveyard. The ocean floor was littered with the rusting skeletons of ships that once carried the lifeblood of an empire. The sea lanes that had fueled Japan's expansion now stood empty, silent, abandoned. A nation built on the movement of goods had been forced into stillness. It didn't happen in a single moment. It happened through thousands of small ones, torpedoes slamming into hulls at dawn, engines coughing their last breath at dusk, convoys scattering under fire, tankers burning until their oil painted the waves black. Each sinking was a thread being cut, and eventually the tapestry of the Japanese war machine simply came apart. Japan entered 1945 with less than 10% of its pre-war merchant fleet still afloat. Oil reserves were nearly gone. Factories ran in darkness or shut down completely. Trains carried wood instead of coal. Cars ran on charcoal. Civilians lived on dwindling rations, while soldiers on distant islands starved or surrendered without ever seeing an American face. Even the grand warships, the carriers and battleships that once symbolized the nation's pride, became floating monuments to a past that no longer existed. They stayed in harbor because there was no fuel to move them. And beneath all of this, unseen but undeniable, were the American submarines that had made it happen. They roamed so close to the Japanese homeland that villagers along the coast reported hearing explosions offshore, night after night. Some submarines began surfacing boldly to finish damaged ships with their deck guns. Others slipped past minefields and patrols to attack the last remnants of coastal shipping inside Japan's own territorial waters. What had once been a calculated campaign had become something far more suffocating, a complete blockade enforced from below the surface. Japan tried everything: escorts, aircraft patrols, better convoys, new detection gear, but the efforts came far too late. There was no longer a fleet left to protect, no longer fuel to sustain it, no longer ships to rescue the empire from starvation. Each attempt to adapt was met with another blow. American submarines had grown too skilled, too experienced, too deeply entrenched in every corner of the Pacific. On paper, the decisive battles of the war were fought at places like Midway, Guadalcanal, and Leyte Gulf. But in reality, the silent war beneath the waves had been quietly rewriting the ending all along. Even if Japan had won a few more battles, even if a few carriers had survived longer, the outcome would not have changed. No nation can fight when its factories are empty, its supply routes destroyed, and its soldiers stranded without food or ammunition. But the strangest part of this story is what Japan could have done, what it should have done, but never did. Their submarines were capable of long-range patrols. They could have raided the American coastline, attacked merchant shipping, disrupted fuel convoys from the Gulf of Mexico, and forced the U.S. to divert resources away from the Pacific front. Even a modest campaign against America's supply lines could have slowed reinforcements, delayed operations, or forced the U.S. Navy to fight a different kind of war. Instead, Japan used its submarines to chase aircraft carriers that rarely appeared, attack destroyers that could defend themselves, and deliver supplies to isolated island garrisons that were already doomed. Brave crews sailed on missions that had no chance of changing the tide. And while they searched for prestige targets, millions of tons of American shipping crossed the ocean unchallenged. This failure wasn't technological. Japanese submarines were large, long-ranged, and innovative. Some carried aircraft, others could travel astonishing distances. The problem was doctrine, a rigid belief that glory lay in battling enemy warships, not strangling enemy commerce. It was a strategy rooted in old traditions, ignoring the brutal arithmetic of modern war. America understood that arithmetic. Japan did not. That difference sealed the empire's fate long before the first American bomber appeared over Japanese cities. Long before the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Long before surrender was discussed in whispered rooms. The war had been lost in the shipping lanes, lost quietly, invisibly, beneath the surface of the sea. And at the center of that silent victory were the submarine crews who lived in cramped steel tubes, weeks at a time, breathing hot recycled air, sleeping next to torpedoes, listening to depth charges hammer the ocean around them. They endured fear that never faded, exhaustion that never lifted, danger that never stopped. But every patrol brought the war closer to an end. Every ship they sank saved countless lives on distant shores. When the war finally ended, many of these submariners returned home unnoticed, overshadowed by the headlines of massive battles and iconic victories. But history would eventually reveal the truth, that a handful of steel hunters had crippled an empire from beneath the waves. They didn't seek glory, they didn't march in parades, they simply did their job, day after day, until there was nothing left for Japan to fight with. The final irony is that the nation most dependent on secure sea routes failed to use its submarines where they mattered most, while the nation least dependent on them used them with devastating precision. It was a reversal of logic so profound that even Japanese officials later admitted it cost them the war years earlier than anyone realized. In the end, Japan was not defeated by the battles it fought, but by the supplies it never received. Not by the ships America brought to the fight, but by the ships Japan lost before the fight even began. The empire was strangled, not by blockades above the water, but by hunters lurking far below it. And this is how two submarine forces, built in the same era and launched into the same war, wrote two completely different stories. One vanished into obscurity, chasing shadows across the ocean. The other cut silently through the darkness, severing the lifelines of an empire until it collapsed beneath the weight of hunger, emptiness, and exhaustion. In the silence that followed, the lesson was unmistakable. Wars are not won only by the battles you fight, but by the ones your enemy never gets the chance to fight at all.